Okay, I think it's better that we get started. And my name is Deliang Chen. I'm from the International Council of Science and ISSC. Before joining ISSC, I was a professor at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. So it's my pleasure to chair this last session today. And we have one speaker and one discussant who is coming. And joining me, we have Dr. Peter Piot, who is sitting here, and also Dr. Adebayo Olukoshi, who will be joining in the discussion of this final speech. I would like to start by introducing our speaker today. And Dr. Peter Piot is the director of the newly established Institute for Global Health at Imperial College London, and a former executive director of UNAIDS. After graduating from the medical school, Dr. Piot was a co-discoverer of the Ebola virus in Zaire in 1976. In the 80s, he launched and expanded collaborative projects in Africa. Project SIDA in Kinshasa was the first international project on AIDS in Africa, and is widely acknowledged as having provided foundations of our understanding of HIV infection in Africa. During his career, he also has been a professor of microbiology and public health at a number of institutes in Nairobi, Brussels, and Lausanne. And this wealth of experience in multinational projects aimed at improving global health was put to good use in 1992, when he joined the global program on AIDS of the World Health Organization in Geneva. He became executive director of the UNAIDS on its creation in 1995. Under his leadership, UNAIDS became the chief advocate for the worldwide action against AIDS. And he has received numerous awards for scientific and societal achievements, and was made Baron by King Albert II of Belgium in 1995. In 2008, he was awarded the Mother Teresa Prize for his work in the fight against AIDS and his role in disseminating knowledge about the diseases. So please join me to welcome Dr. Piot to make your speech.
Can you hear? Yeah, this is on. First of all, let me thank Gudrun Hennis for inviting me here, but above all for your leadership and your support when you were leading UNESCO's effort in the fight against AIDS as part of UNAIDS. These were sometimes difficult years, and every ally was very precious. As you heard, I'm a physician by training and a microbiologist. I don't speak the language of social sciences, and I'm used to medical conferences where you get 10 minutes for a PowerPoint presentation like a machine gun, and in the hermetic jargon of my tribe. So what I'm doing here? What am I doing here in the Social Science Forum? I'm here because throughout my professional life, I've learned that the increasingly complex issues of our globalized time can only be effectively addressed through multidisciplinary action. And I've also learned that both technological innovation and the contributions of social science often get lost in translation. They get lost in translation into policy, and particularly into action to benefit people. And with this in mind, I will tell the story of the AIDS response, the global AIDS response, to illustrate and to discuss two crucial issues for society and governance today. One, how can we foster genuine multidisciplinary, multisectoral research and action? And two, how can we better inform policy? Much of what I will say is based on my nearly 15 years experience As you heard, Executive Director of UNAIDS. I was also Under Secretary General of the United Nations. And because of its complex nature, AIDS offers a quasi-ideal case study, offering a window on how several sectors and disciplines can actually work together for results, can work in synergy, or cannot work together with the results that are then undermined. The AIDS epidemic also shows how a concerted worldwide response against a new phenomenon is transforming public health and international development practice. So before going into the heart of my presentation, let me share a few reflections on the AIDS epidemic. This is a disease which was discovered in 1981. So nearly 30 years ago, it was unknown. It's now the leading cause of death in Africa. And in these days of great media attention for the swine flu, it may be useful to remind ourselves that every single day, about 6,000 people die from AIDS somewhere in the world. And every day, about 7,000 people around the world become infected with HIV, including here in Norway. And also consider this tale of globalization, because it's not only financial markets that are flying around the world, it's also viruses. The well over 60 million people who have cumulatively been infected with HIV are all connected to each other, because you can only be infected through contact with somebody else or through contact with another person's blood. So they're all part of a mostly invisible networks across the world. It gives a new dimension to the notion of blood relatives, isn't it? And today we're still largely in the dark as to these social networks, what they are, how they function. And we seem to know more about the virus and how it behaves than about the behavior of humans, of the host of the virus. Last year, for the first time since I was head of UNAIDS, we could announce some large-scale impact of our collective efforts, finally. As a result of collective action, over 4 million people in low and middle-income countries are now alive because of antiretroviral therapy, as compared to only a few 100,000 even 5 years ago. This is an unprecedented achievement in international development. And today, less people are dying and less people are becoming infected with HIV, even if we still have a long way to go and AIDS is far from being over, as I just mentioned. So how did we get there? It was a unique synergy between science, politics, and money that generated community action and results. And it produced results where few expected them. And it's also an illustration of several new developments in our globalized society. And in that sense, it follows very well the previous debate. First, on the science. The principal scientific breakthrough in terms of AIDS was the discovery of antiretroviral drugs which can treat HIV infection. With lifelong treatment, AIDS suddenly was no longer an unavoidable death sentence, even if it's not a cure, this treatment. And very soon after the announcement in July 1996 that HIV had become a treatable infection, the drugs were widely available in high-income countries, and mortality from AIDS dropped radically in the West. Thus, in these countries, both the reality and the perception of AIDS radically changed. However, as I pointed out at the conference where this exciting discovery was announced in Vancouver in 1996, this breakthrough would not make any difference for the overwhelming majority of people with HIV who are living in the developing countries, unless the price of medicines would come down drastically from the $14,000 per person per year that they costed at that time. And as the theme of this forum so rightly states, it became one planet, worlds apart, once again. Déjà vu. And it would require this unprecedented global mobilization before these drugs would be available in the developing world. But what really made a difference was political action. With a few notable exceptions, such as Brazil, Thailand, Senegal, and Uganda, Leadership on AIDS across the world had been very poor, to the absolute neglect. But at the turn of the new millennium, there was a growing political momentum around AIDS in which UNAIDS played a central role. Much of this action culminated in the UN General Assembly Special Session on AIDS in New York in June 2001, when all member states of the United Nations, including 45 heads of state and government, committed to a roadmap to defeat AIDS. It was also the first time that the General Assembly, the UN, devoted a special session to a health issue. This political momentum, which would last about 5 years, was grounded in 5 streams that came together. The first one was a new type of civil society activism, particularly by people living with HIV, who were literally fighting for their survival, to ask for access to life-saving treatment. And the most powerful example is the Treatment Action Campaign, or TAG, in South Africa. It was founded by Zaki Ahmed, a gay man living with HIV, who refused treatment as long as the government would not provide it to his fellow brothers and sisters who need it. And it rapidly became a mass movement in a country with over 5 million HIV-infected citizens, and with a long history, as we all know, of political struggle. Through political agitation and legal action, a broad societal coalition led by TAC obtained several major victories over the government of South Africa, which by now is running the largest treatment program in the world for AIDS. Around the same time, AIDS activists in the West woke up to the catastrophe unfolding in the developing world, particularly in Africa. Until then, they had focused exclusively on the situation in their own countries. And their international action crystallized around the creation of a specific multilateral funding mechanism for AIDS, which led to the creation of the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. Various activist groups quickly and efficiently connected to one another to form a virtual global movement, which is now an inherent part of the governance of the AIDS response. Along with the environmental activists, it's probably the prime example of a transnational civil society movement of a new kind, with very rapid responses and a very informal network without one specific leader, all made possible by contemporary communication, technology from cell phones to Facebook and Twitter. And perhaps it's another dimension of what Saskia Sassen's TAR, my latest acronym, but I'll leave that to Saskia to see whether that fits in that paradigm. A second defining element for the global AIDS movement was the emergence of a brilliant coalition, along the lines that Adam Hochschild describes in Bury the Chains, this remarkable history of the movement of the abolition of slavery in England in the 18th and 19th centuries. AIDS produced unlikely bedfellows, such as the Alliance Around AIDS Response in South Africa, which included AIDS activists, bishops, scientists, trade unionists, communists, and the Chamber of Mines, who would never agree on anything except a very clear program to defeat the AIDS epidemic. And it was essential that we got out of the ghetto of AIDS activists and AIDS doctors, often fighting with each other. On the research front, it meant the involvement of a major part of the wide spectrum of scientific disciplines, including social scientists. A third critical element was a repositioning of AIDS, from a medical kuriosum and disease of gay men and Africans to a global health problem with profound development, social justice, human rights, and human security implications. So AIDS became a topic at the board of the World Bank, the annual meetings of finance ministers hosted by the Economic Commission for Africa, the World Social Forum, the World Economic Forum, the UN Human Rights Council, and so on. And in January 2000, then Vice President Al Gore chaired a session of the UN Security Council on AIDS in Africa. It was the first time that the Security Council, the UN, debated a health issue, often perceived as too soft for security issues in the eyes of classic security scholars and politicians. Since then, it has expanded its realm to debate other social issues relevant for human security. And again, and as so often, AIDS was a pathfinder. A fourth factor that played a key role in the AIDS political momentum was a decline in the price of antiretroviral drugs that UNAIDS negotiated, helped by activism. And it was subsequently enhanced by the appearance of manufacturers of generic medicines in India. Politicians now felt they could support a solution, quote unquote, for the AIDS problem with measurable short-term results in terms of lives saved. And a bonus in the eyes of some leaders was that they didn't have to deal with sex and drugs, homosexuality and gender, the sensitive issues inherent in addressing HIV prevention. And finally, what turned out to be a coherent series of global and regional political events in 2001 captured the various streams I just described. President Obasanjo from Nigeria hosted a special summit on AIDS at the Organization of African Unity, as it was then called, breaking years of silence on AIDS by African leaders, who were nearly all present. And 2 months later, the UN General Assembly held its special session on AIDS, as mentioned before, and followed by a G8 summit in Japan, all addressing the issue. This political leadership then led to the third pillar of the triad that resulted in the current achievements in the AIDS response, money. And a fairly unexpected, I must say, powerful ally greatly amplified the efforts of other donor nations. President G.W. Bush, who asked Congress for $15 billion for his emergency plan for AIDS relief in the State of the Union address in 2003. These billions radically changed the funding landscape of the AIDS response and led to the $14 billion spent on AIDS in low and middle income countries last year, over 50 times what was spent when AIDS was launched in '96, when UNAIDS was launched. So the young history of the AIDS response illustrates again that for social change to happen, a number of conditions have to converge. And as our ancestors knew so well, it's only when the stars are perfectly aligned that big things can happen. We've also demonstrated that a well-aligned global movement, as disorganized it may look like from the outside, a pluralist global movement involving a wide range of actors can move an agenda against all odds. So it's increasingly clear now that the AIDS response has been transformational for public health, international development practice, and several societal issues. Let me briefly list 5 issues to illustrate this. First, the agenda in AIDS has been driven by both scientific evidence and by a strong human rights perspective. It's interesting to note how AIDS has not only exposed injustices, such as gender inequality, racism, discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, but it has also helped to overcome injustices. For example, it has played a key role in the gay rights movement in the 1980s and 90s in the West and Latin America, and today in an increasing number of African and Asian countries. It has also broken taboos around the right to access expensive medicines in poor countries through a revision of the TRIPS rules of WTO and the right to produce generic medicines. In this sense, a catastrophe was turned into positive social change. Secondly, the preeminence of policy for progress has been very strong in the AIDS response. Whenever there were good politics, we made progress. Whenever there were bad politics, it led to more infections and more deaths. And an extreme example is the denialist position of President Thabo Mbeki's government in South Africa, which did not accept that AIDS was a viral illness and treatable illness, building on the position of a few scientists from California. The resulting delay in introducing antiretroviral therapy in South Africa cost over 300,000 lives, according to a recent study by Harvard researchers. Likewise, the refusal of governments around the world, from the United States to Russia to Thailand, to provide clean needles and syringes and substitution therapy to injecting drug users, continues to fuel an HIV epidemic out of control among drug users and is responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of drug users. That policy change is possible was illustrated by the decision 2005 by the Chinese leadership to promote the so-called harm reduction programs for injecting drug users, a sea change from former purely police approaches. And I can give numerous other examples. So our policies can mean life or death when it comes to AIDS. So let's never forget that our sometimes academic debates or our policy debates are not just intellectually exciting, but can have implications for humans and can be the difference between life and death. A third way in which the AIDS response is transforming public health is that it's so strongly embedded in community engagement. Contemporary public health is largely driven by top-down imposed cost-effective solutions, but then to the surprise of experts, don't have the results that they had imagined because they failed or forgot to talk to people. In the case of AIDS, initial reluctance by governments to deal with the AIDS crisis gave the space for communities, and particularly people living with HIV, to become prominent actors in the response. Classically first as activists, as I said, or self-support groups, such as the AIDS Support Organization in Uganda, but gradually now also as policymakers and implementers. And one of the mottos of the AIDS movement became, "Nothing for the people without the people," whatever the good intentions may be. And it also meant better results. Today, what we call in Dutch ervaringsdeskundigen, literally in English, experience experts, and civil society representatives are at the tables of local and international governance mechanisms of the AIDS response, from numerous national AIDS councils and country coordinating mechanisms of the Global Fund, to the boards of an intergovernmental organization such as UNAIDS, a multilateral financing mechanism such as the Global Fund, or UN General Assembly sessions on AIDS. Sometimes this involvement is token, but increasingly it's genuine. And it has introduced a new form of democracy in many communities and has tremendously enriched the response. But it still meets with enormous resistance from the medical community, governments and administrations who want to preserve this power status quo, as you can imagine. But it also challenges the good old Westphalian paradigm of international relations. A fourth transformational aspect of the AIDS response is its resolute embracement of multidisciplinarity and the involvement of many sectors in society beyond health. And the absence of a technological fix may have played a role in this unusual diversity of actors working towards a common goal. And finally, as I argued earlier, the AIDS response has by far been the most exceptional example of a genuine global public good. High-income countries set up new, highly focused multilateral funding mechanisms which are demand-driven and performance-based. They've had remarkable results, but they remain untested as for their long-term viability and impact. We had to overcome numerous obstacles, many of which have not gone away, from beliefs about gender, social equity, sex, and drugs. In other words, in the AIDS response, we're in the domains of culture, ideology, religion, all study areas of the social sciences. So after a lifetime of work in public health, I'm deeply convinced that its problems will not be solved by focusing on medicine and epidemiology alone. And just this afternoon, we had a very interesting session on the fundamental role of social determinants in health, based on the groundbreaking work of Michael Marmot and the Commission on Social Determinants of Health that he chaired for the World Health Organization. We've seen quite a few failed attempts of multidisciplinary work in the AIDS and health fields, but also some good examples, such as the commission I just mentioned, or the Commission on Macroeconomics and Health, which came from a totally different perspective, and a new project that I'm leading on AIDS 2031 to look into the long-term strategies to deal with AIDS. But at a very practical level, there has been very productive collaboration on one of the most stigmatized and politicized problems that we're confronted with in AIDS, and that's drug addiction. This has led to highly effective HIV prevention programs, again, where people were not expected. And yet, even in AIDS, multidisciplinary work remains the exception rather than the rule. I don't have the time to go into the silos in education, research funding, the complexity and magnitude of information which are at the basis of this. But I would like now to go into the last part of my talk, and that is, what can the social sciences provide to policymakers? For nearly 15 years, I guess I could be called a policymaker as the head of UNAIDS. And as a former researcher and professor, I always tried to have the best possible science to inform me, in addition to considerations of justice and equity. But this often turned out to be very difficult, sometimes because the evidence was not there yet, was incomplete, or I was confronted with competing theories and explanations of the reality of the future. And in addition, I got a feeling that much knowledge produced by the social sciences got lost in translation through esoteric communication and oversell. So how can a decision maker cope with a situation when there are 5 different models, which may be totally justified and relevant because there are at least 5 different ways of looking at one aspect of reality? And who can be the traffic cop here in this kind of situation? From my perspective as a global policymaker, the social sciences should ideally fulfill 3 major needs in addition to one that I will mention at the end. One is providing a theoretical framework, 2, analyzing and explaining, and 3, helping to find solutions. And above all, I would say, raising new questions to keep us all on track in terms of strategy and connections with the real world. First, a few comments on theoretical frameworks. As you all know, social theories have had enormous impact on the construction of the modern world. But they also have shaped to a large extent the current model of the AIDS response, which since Jonathan Mander, a charismatic founder of WHO's global program on AIDS in 1986, has been embedded in a rights-based approach. This rights-based approach, as the foundation of our response, has been regularly under attack from the more classic public health practitioners who argue that only technical evidence should guide the response, not considerations of equity. And as mentioned earlier, a major issue in AIDS have been conspiracy theories and denial that HIV exists or is the cause of AIDS. These were not ideas, funny ideas of politicians, but of scientists. And when a head of state embraces them, human lives are at stake. Equally dangerous for me are the medical scientists in the AIDS field who try to impose a single magic bullet solution. As such, pseudo-solutions undermine comprehensive efforts and create confusion in people's minds. Today, the AIDS response is in great need of theoretical insights into concepts of leadership, of societal and individual coping and resilience mechanisms, and interaction between epidemics and social stability and governance, along the line of the work that Alex Doal and others have initiated. We're also struggling with a de facto post-Westphalian international governance of the AIDS response at many levels, where a loosely organized transnational civil society has been highly influential in setting international and national agendas, including even in allocating resources. And I think more is to come, and more is to come hopefully in other areas. In addition, the experience of AIDS should be highly relevant in the emerging formulation of theories around smart foreign policy, the position of global public goods in international relations, and the complex question of national sovereignty and the right to intervene when states don't protect their citizens from disease or human rights violations, as has been the case for AIDS in a number of countries. And can a country be called sovereign when hundreds of thousands of its citizens depend for their daily survival on a vote in a parliament 5,000 kilometers away, that parliament which will decide whether funding for antiretroviral therapy will continue in that country? These are new challenges, not only in theory, but in practice. And the worst situation is when we don't know that we don't know. It reminds me of a clandestine underground theater I visited in Budapest, I think it was in 1970. And for about 90 minutes, only one sentence was said. That's why I can remember it, because my Hungarian is not that great. And it was something like, nemertem, mert nemertem. And it meant, I was told, I don't know why I don't know. This was subversive theater, but that's why we need social science theories, that we at least should know why we don't know and what we don't know. Secondly, analysis and explanation. As decision makers, we not only need theories, but also the methods of social science and explanations to understand what is going on around us. The health field, we're in desperate need for more social science analysis, even if it's grossly underfunded, and that must change. Consider vaccination coverage in contemporary Western societies. Vaccines are one of the greatest advances in medical history and have saved millions and millions of lives, more than virtually any other medical discovery. It has even eradicated disease, smallpox, and many serious and potentially fatal infections such as measles, whooping cough, diphtheria, and so on, have virtually disappeared in our parts of the world. And yet, many Western societies are experiencing increasing refusal by parents to immunize their children, out of a concern about safety. And of course, as for any medical intervention, side effects do occur, sometimes serious ones. The problem is not only occurring in disfavored, low socioeconomic populations, as is generally the case for most instances of poor access to healthcare and prevention. In the US, unvaccinated children are more likely to be white, from high-income households, and have a married mother with a university education, with a consequence that is where we now have the complications for these preventable infectious diseases. Does this challenge our well-documented assumptions that education, particularly of girls, leads to better health? No, not really. But it illustrates once more that realities of life are more complex than single linear explanations, that social phenomena and personal decision-making are full of little understood complexities and contradictions, and that culture can play as much a role as social and economic status. AIDS provides a similar challenge to the conventional wisdom about the association between poverty and disease. Whereas about all major causes of ill health affect the poor far more than the wealthy, HIV infection, and is well studied in Africa, is far more common among the higher income categories than among the poorer ones. However, it is particularly associated with inequality. In the first place, gender inequality, social inequality, which put people into vulnerable situations in terms of decision-making about sex. Just taking these two examples from health, the challenge is then not only to explain, but to also to refine our conceptual frameworks. And telling a poor woman in a slum to just say no to sex with her husband or to survival sex is as effective as saying, have a nice day to somebody who's clinically depressed. And yet, there are popular proponents of abstinence programs or others who claim that sexual decisions are just a matter of individual will. So high on my own AIDS wish list for social science research are an unraveling of human sexual and addictive behavior in different contexts, an understanding of the structural drivers impacting on the AIDS response, and analytical tools for policy decisions and leadership. And lastly, translate knowledge into solutions. Ultimately, we need to translate innovation. And by innovation, I'm not only thinking of technological innovation, but also social science discoveries. We need to translate them into day-to-day realities to benefit people much faster than we are currently doing. But let's not be blinded by this contemporary urge to innovate, and have something new, and be blinded by innovation as the only way toward progress. The sad truth is, we need a lot more of the same, as uninspiring this may be for intellectuals and unappealing for politicians always looking for announcing the next campaign. Think of the low coverage of many effective social and health programs where the needed innovation is often about the how and not so much about the what. Since I came from academia when I took up my job in the UN, I was initially very puzzled by the poor impact of data and evidence on policies when it comes to AIDS specifically. And interestingly and somewhat unusually, I was at the same time a policymaker and therefore a consumer of research and analysis, but also an interpreter of science and an advocate for science-informed policies with the political world. So I found that the main obstacles in terms of policy decisions in AIDS and in other policy issues are not a matter of understanding of scientific evidence, but they are firmly rooted into beliefs. And interest often trumps insights, including among scientists, I should say. It became clear to me that promoting only evidence-based policies is insufficient at the best, counterproductive at the worst. First, there is as yet no evidence base for many issues, even about the meaning of life or the existence of God. And when the evidence base is weak or conflicting, then the question that arises is, whose evidence? Secondly, this major disagreement among disciplines what constitutes evidence, with the medical community in general only accepting quantitative results and results from controlled clinical or community trials. If we would only accept such stringent criteria as the sole base for policy, this would lead to paralysis, and we would ignore the basic values which should underpin policy, such as equity, social justice, human rights. Because of the highly incomplete evidence base and the need for including societal values in decision-making, evidence-informed policies are the way to go, informed but not only based. Now a reality test. How often does evidence really influence policy? And in particular, how often does it influence beliefs? In the AIDS field, we have numerous examples of moral beliefs overriding evidence in policymaking. One example is the abstinence-only policies of the Bush administration, which otherwise had a remarkable track record on AIDS in the developing world. And despite a lack of evidence for effectiveness of such programs, the previous US Congress massively funded with billions abstinence-only programs to stop HIV transmission. And last July, the current Congress abolished the program when reauthorizing the President's emergency plan for AIDS relief. And last week, President Obama eliminated funding for these programs domestically. In all these cases, it was really not scientific evidence that led to either decision, but it was politics and beliefs. So science has often not been the main determinant in AIDS-related policy decisions, but political action, be it from AIDS activists, gay activists, or from conservative and religious activists. If we as scientists want to change the world, we may have to invest more in a dialogue with those forces in society that ultimately shape policy. And in the case of AIDS, this meant that I had to interact with pleasure with scientists, politicians, HIV-positive people, church leaders, businessmen, many more, in order to move policy along the lines of what I believe were the best evidence and the best policies to defeat the AIDS epidemic. And it's clear that if we're not willing to get our hands dirty, even more of the science will get lost in translation. So to conclude, let me share a few thoughts on the way forward. None of my thoughts is original, but often breakthroughs come from pushing more of the same at the right time, I believe. First, let's agree once and for all that we must come to terms with complexity and incorporate it in our work and theories. The reality is messy, as Helga Novotny said yesterday. Second, how ready are the social sciences for the new wave of technological innovations of the next 10 years? I'm thinking of miniaturized medical equipment, medical surveillance systems, nanotech computing, brainwave interacting toys, reformed urban transit systems, and so on and so on. It's urgent to anticipate now their impact, opportunities and risks, and to work with developers, marketers, and consumers of technology. The technologies, of course, we use in our day-to-day life are largely spin-offs from the natural sciences, but their use and place in economic and social development are largely a matter for the social sciences. Third, one obvious and, in my view, really urgent agenda is to create incentives for multidisciplinary education and research and careers, and funding of research. This will require some fundamental reforms, and it will require genuine respect for other methodologies than our own. And fourth, we must all communicate far better. We've heard that so many times. As so much valuable information is lost in translation, where a certain arrogance of science is competing with a certain arrogance of power. But that's a competition we can never win, I tell you. Above all, please keep asking questions and keep questioning ourselves and those in power wherever in society. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Björk, for the inspiring speech. And I think it's very interesting to hear your points as a scientist and also a policymaker. And also it's not only the knowledge that matters in the policy making, but also the communication, politics, and the money is also important factors. So with that, I would like to introduce our discussant. And Dr. Olukoshi, who hails from Nigeria, was in March this year Executive Secretary of the Council for Development of Social Science Research in Africa. And Dr. Olukoshi holds a PhD in politics from the University of Leeds in the UK. Before arriving at Cordesria, he was a research professor and director of research and studies at Nigerian Institute of International Affairs. For 6 years, he was also a senior research fellow and a research program coordinator of the research program on the political and societal context of structural adjustment in Sub-Saharan Africa at the Nordic Africa Institute in Uppsala, Sweden. And last but not by no means least, he is also a member of the ISSC's Executive Committee, as introduced by the Secretary General in the beginning, and also chairs the Council's Committee on Developing and Transition Economics. So please, Dr. Olukoshi.
Thank you very much. I have listened to the lecture fresh, like the rest of you. Ahead of coming here, I prepared some notes, not having had the privilege of getting the paper in advance. I prepared some notes on the theme of the session. And I've enjoyed very much the presentation, particularly the conclusions which Peter drew and the challenges which he poses to the scientific community. I'm going to leave aside the notes I had prepared on the difficult relationship between policy and research and attempt an on-the-spot response to the main thrust of Peter's presentation as a way of stimulating debate and discussion. I think the important element of multidisciplinarity, and place of multidisciplinarity in his presentation is a theme which ran through and with which I don't think any of us will disagree. In many senses, I would in fact suggest that the place and role of multidisciplinarity in understanding pandemics like the HIV/AIDS one or any other disease or any other complex phenomenon can, in a certain sense, begin to be taken for granted. What probably we need to address our minds to as a next stage, and here, of course, I agree that it's important that we have the courage to reconfigure our educational systems, because that also, we all pay sometimes lip service, sometimes serious engagement to the role of multidisciplinarity, but we don't take the next important step of moving either personal research or institutional arrangements and frameworks to try to respond to those, to the demands of multidisciplinarity. In the particular case of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, I think the challenge we are confronted with is one of establishing an equal footing for the disciplines in grappling with the problems posed by the pandemic. Now, of course, the biomedical sciences did have a head start, and the bulk of the resources that were available to undertake research and to find solutions to the pandemic. It was initially, in fact, treated as, strictly speaking, a medical challenge. And to the extent to which, to this day, steps have been taken to try to move beyond the biomedical sciences, including from the biomedical community itself, to mobilize other disciplines, particularly the social sciences. It is only in terms and defined in terms of what biomedical science thinks it needs in order to better tackle the pandemic. Not so much what we need as a community of scientists working together, but what biomedical science needs in order to respond effectively to the pandemic. And I think this creates a disequilibrium, both in the definition of the problem, but also in the kinds of solutions that we try to put forward. I'd like to suggest that beyond even the social sciences, we need to begin to think of ways of bringing in the humanities, because there's an important cultural dimension. There are stories of HIV/AIDS and of livelihoods which are constructed. There are traditions and customs that are beginning to disappear and new ones that are being invented around the pandemic, for which perhaps the humanities are better placed than even the social scientists, less still the biomedical sciences, to respond effectively, to capture, to document, and to see how all of these add up to enable communities ravaged by the pandemic to make sense of their livelihoods and to make sense of their lives and the essence of their existence. So multidisciplinary, yes, but the terms of multidisciplinarity have to be fought out, I suggest, and fought out in a way that will ensure that there is an equal privileging of the different disciplines, rather than establishing one discipline, biomedical sciences, as the high discipline of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, and other disciplines as the subsidiary accompanying disciplines that help to fill little gaps here and there in understanding. I think that way we might have a chance of achieving a much more rounded understanding of the pandemic. Suppose in a certain sense, flowing from all of this is also the assumption from the whole perception of the pandemic initially as, strictly speaking, a medical problem, was also the concentration of attention in a very partial way on health concerns and on the health sector, as it were. And I think perhaps Thabo Mbeki may have been seduced by minority scientists in California, but one of the good things about the intervention which he made was the fact that he pointed to the interconnectedness between the health problems that we were confronted with across the world, especially in Africa, and other sectors of society and economy, of industry, of agriculture, of production, more generally speaking, of finance, of the integrated nature of the problems, which might manifest themselves in one instance as a major health challenge, but which cannot be solved only on the basis of a focus on the health sector, but would in fact require that we pay attention to what is happening to poverty, to what is happening to employment, to what is happening to a variety of things that will not instinctively or automatically be defined as falling within the health domain, but which are eminently important in defining capacities, individual and institutional, to respond to the pandemic. And I think here again, there's still a lot of work to be done. So that, for instance, if we are talking about the capacities of societies to respond, and even if we come up with all of the treatments that we are able to procure from biomedical scientific investments to tackle the pandemic, we might in fact still live with the problem in important swathes of the world, precisely because health systems have simply collapsed in those parts of the world. In a situation in which much of greater Washington, D.C., medical centers are run by Ethiopian doctors on a brain drain. Ethiopia trains the doctors, they migrate to the United States, settle around Washington, D.C., or South African nurses, Botswana, Zimbabwe, the movement of talent out of health systems that are collapsing, and which effectively mean that the kinds of systemic responses, system-wide responses which we need in order to be able to tackle the pandemic effectively also eludes us. I think it's important that we bring this in. And these are not themselves, they are of course issues and problems that are critical to the successes of biomedical achievements and innovation, but which are not themselves necessarily domains with which biomedical science will grapple or for which it even has the competence effectively to respond. They are domains of policy and of politics that speak to a variety of power relations and asymmetries. I think there's also a dimension of the global response which, in the absence of effective local health systems, which in the absence of effective local health capacities arising from the brain drain and a whole host of other factors, which I think points us to the limits of the kinds of global responses that we are able to mobilize. Because I'm not myself persuaded that for all of the goodwill that might underpin global humanitarian responses, the use of civil society organizations, the use of a variety of networks to try to deliver treatment, if you do not fix the public health system and ensure that there's an effective public health system, as well as the existence of a capable public health coordination framework that also involves the mobilization of private providers of health services, that you are going to be able to solve problems of this nature on a sustained and an enduring basis. So that ultimately, again, it seems to me that the interventions represented by the establishment of outfits such as UNAIDS or the creation of PEPFAR or the work of the Gates Foundation and the rest can only be seen as temporary interventions, stopgap measures, pending when we are able to reinvest ourselves in building the capacity of public institutions locally to deliver and to deliver effectively in the provisioning of health as indeed in other domains of human livelihood. I cannot miss the opportunity to say that the example that we are confronted with in the domain of global health service delivery shows, in my views, the limits of the kinds of proposals which neoliberal Talibans like Paul Collier propose, that we should have institutions, independent service delivery institutions that should replace the state in Africa and deliver services to African, to ordinary people across the continent, because ultimately they are not grounded. There's no institutional rooting. There's no institutional grounding to a lot of these. And they are basically experienced in a way that then leads me to the third element, the fourth element of my comment, which is that whilst welcoming the rights-based underpinning, and I think Peter and his colleagues in UNAIDS must be congratulated. Peter did a lot of work personally in this regard to fighting stigma and to ensuring that those who live with HIV are not unnecessarily discriminated against at the workplace, even within the family and the household and all of it, effective campaigns which were undertaken and which are still going on. But ultimately, if the institutions of service delivery continue to be offshore institutions, the important and necessary role of the citizen as a procurer and consumer of health is going to be undermined. And ultimately, the very framework of service delivery, which in a certain sense, for it to be really citizen-based, must also be able to respond to demands of citizen accountability, undermines the very democratic ethos that should drive the health delivery process. I have always missed the presence of history in the HIV/AIDS debate, Codestria, for which I worked until a month ago, had a program on the social sciences and HIV/AIDS. We struggled very hard to find historians who will simply look at the history of pandemics, forget about all of the policies and treatment and how to get people to comply with taking their antiretroviral drugs, how to change youth behavior, how to address gender issues. All of those were legitimate issues for social scientists to research. But pandemics are not new in the history of our world. And how have communities and individuals responded to pandemics historically? And how have new traditions been created? How have new cultures emerged that will enable us to go beyond a discourse on culture in the context of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, which tends to suggest that the culture of a particular people makes them prone to contracting the virus? That Africans, for example, are too promiscuous. It's in their culture. They inherit widows. Those are not discourses that are very helpful, because the very context of the inheritance of widows was probably itself an historical response to a particular situation. And we need historians of health as well as historians of cultural and social processes to be able to understand the way in which traditions are invented and dissolved in a manner as to ground our interventions also in historical processes. Ultimately, therefore, I think Peter's suggestion that we need to ask questions, we need to raise questions, is probably the biggest contribution that those of us in the social sciences will be able to make to the building of a genuinely multidisciplinary response to the pandemic. And in that regard, it means effectively that the tendency in some of the AIDS activist circles to try to promote the notion of a single unidimensional discourse around the pandemic is hardly itself helpful to science, which by definition abhors single unidimensional monolithic discourse that tends to be religion or ideology or fundamentalism of the bottom billion type. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your interesting thoughts with us. I'm sorry, because of the time limit, so we just take one question from the audience. Yeah, back there.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. I was excited that you took some examples from South Africa, one of the hero and one of the villain. And I wondered in your interpretation, especially the demonization of President Mbeki as having contributed to the death of 300,000 people, I really struggled with that analysis and its hermeneutics, in the sense that my president, I'm from the University of South Africa, had raised issues of poverty as contributing to the exacerbation of HIV and AIDS. And in your presentation, you're noting that in the North, where the health systems were in place, where the financial mechanisms were available, people were able to live well with HIV and AIDS. And the contradiction with the collapse of the health systems in Africa due to structural adjustment programs, due to the withdrawal of funding into health, it did not come in your analysis. And I'm wondering, are we not falling prey into the demonization of epistemological frameworks and questioning by Africans or by those who are considered marginal in these debates? I really struggled also with the notion that you are claiming that there must be a sense in which there is a multidisciplinary approach, and yet you didn't even acknowledge the contradictions and the complexity of ignoring knowledge systems and responses to HIV and AIDS that came. For example, the fact that pharmaceutical companies were not willing to allow the sale of antiretrovirals, were suing the government of South Africa when they were trying to make this available, did not appear. The fact that the violation of the poor in the clinical trials on HIV and AIDS, nevirapine, and other antiretrovirals were also exacerbating the HIV. And the fact that majority of the researchers, biomedical researchers, were from the north and sometimes insensitive to the cultural expressions of the people in Africa have not been attended to. And I think it's important that our hermeneutics is also accountable, does not promote racist discourse that disallows the voices of Africa. Thank you.
Okay, so very brief response. First of all, I agree with all the points that Olo had made, and so these were very welcome additions. I would say that on the specific points, because of the sake of time, I believe that the reason that there is a hyper-endemic of HIV in southern Africa, not in the rest of Africa. In West Africa, we have, Washington, D.C. has a higher HIV prevalence than, than most West African countries. But that's embedded in the history of the division of labor and the destruction of male identities by the apartheid regime and by colonial times. I mean, this is I've spoken a lot about that, and that's, so I don't take it that I cannot discuss everything at the same time. And of course, a very important point that President Becky made, and I think is what the need to involve other sectors than health in health action. And as I mentioned in my presentation, social determinants of health are very well identified. And it's exactly what we try to do in UNAIDS, is to bring in the various other sectors. There is enormous resistance to that from the public health community. And it is true that with the collapse of health systems in many countries, that's playing a role. But I think fundamentally, the drivers in Southern Africa have really been more of an order, are embedded in the past. That's why I think also historians would be useful from that perspective. Not only the response to pandemics, but also where are the structural origins of this epidemic. It didn't fall out of the sky. And let's put aside, indeed, fantasies about sexuality in Africa and so on. I think they've been discussed. I did mention the whole issue of the AIDS movement has broken the taboos about TRIPS. TRIPS is about intellectual property, and therefore I think that is for me, is opening the field to many other issues in health, but also outside health. But I think these are all very valid comments, and as long as a response to something like AIDS is not embedded in a community, in individuals, it won't work. The response can only come from inside. And therefore, I fully agree that this kind of international response is temporary. But without that, things would have been even worse. Thank you.
Thank you. With this, I conclude this session for today. And thank you, our speaker, and also our discussant and audience. Bye-bye.